stream and start it again. No, it's enabled because it's gonna to start in 10 minutes. Okay. Doc co-speaker is going to introduce all of us, I guess. Let's wait for these 2 minutes. Oh, hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Okay, so all of us are here already. Great. And what about the stream? It's gonna to start. Natalia, can you see it on Facebook?
I have one question. Are you moderating, Oksana?
We'll try. Me and Irina.
Irina, okay, great.
Both of us, yeah.
Jessica, you know Irina?
Not yet personally.
No, nice to meet you.
We are during university.
Yes, it's very nice to meet you from Frankfurt Viadrina, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, right.
From Kiev Darnitsa.
Yeah, well,
our delegate.
True.
Nice.
It's true.
Okay, so as far as I can see, the stream has already started on Facebook as well. Can you see it, Natalia?
Not yet.
Just
Should I check it?
try to open the event.
Oksana, I have one more request.
Yeah, of course.
If possible, can I go last? I would like to give Emily and Sophia more time if we run short on time, just in case. Can you have me last? Okay, great. Hi, Emily and Sophia.
Yeah, we'll introduce you and then yeah. Okay, so I can see the video on Facebook. I don't know what about, and we have 3 viewers already.
Yes.
Yeah, so let us probably start. So first of all, I want to introduce you the co-host of this event, and we have already mentioned her. It's Irina Kovalenko, and she's a doctoral researcher at the Collaborative Research Center Interventing Arts, working on the PhD thesis Practices of Artistic Intervention During the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity. And she has been working on this thesis since April 2022. And she has obtained her bachelor's degree in German studies at the Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University in 2019 and received the DAT scholarship for graduate students from Ukraine at the European University Viadrina Frankfurt Oder. And she completed a master's degree in literary studies at the European University of Viadrina. And in winter term of 2023-2024, she teaches a seminar on Ukrainian literature after 1991. But what I would like to add is that Irina is our partner, and she has organized a great exhibition at Viadrina University. It's the exhibition about the arts of Maidan, the exhibition that was created 10 years ago, and Natalia and Marian Luniv were the initiators of this project, and now this exhibition is in Germany, and fortunately there were no excesses, right? And everyone who wants can see it still, right? Am I right, Irina? It's still working, right?
Yeah, that's right. The Viadrina will be in the next 10 days, so until the 1st of March. And thank you very much for your very kind introduction. And that without you, this also exhibition, the Viadrina wouldn't be possible without you, Oksana, and without you, Natalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And today we are going to introduce 3 books about Maidan. And you know that the anniversary of Maidan and the anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity is forthcoming, and we'll celebrate, if it's possible to say, celebrate all the events that happened in February. If you will start doing it in a few days, that's why I think that this presentation is rather symbolic.
I would like to start with introducing Emily, General Justice, who is the director of TMRT Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. And her book, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine, explores the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests from a very special perspective and very interesting perspective through in-depth ethnographic research with leftist, feminist, and student activists in Kyiv. And the book discusses the very productive concept of self-organization and the notion that if something needs to be done and the person has the competence to do it, then they should simply do it. So basically the motto that many of us have been lived up to for several years already.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Sophia Wilson, who's Associate Professor of Political Science, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Sophia is also the president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. And today, Sophia Wilson will present her forthcoming book, or is it already published? I don't know, Sophia, you will clarify the situation, I guess. So the book is called Maidan, Ukraine's Democratic Revolution. And the perspective of the book is rather interesting as well. But I guess I will just give Sophia the floor to tell more about the book, not to spoil. Okay, and Irina, probably you'll introduce Jessica.
Exactly. The last but not the least is Dr. Jessica Zikovic from the University of Michigan, right? And Jessica is the director of the Fulbright program in Ukraine and Institute of International Education Kyiv office. And she was also a Fulbright US scholar to Ukraine in 2017-2018. And her book, Superfluous Women, tells the unique story of a generation of artists, feminists, and queer activists who emerged in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. With a focus on new media, Jessica demonstrates how contemporary artist collectives in Ukraine have contested Soviet and Western connotations of feminism to draw attention to a range of human rights issues with global impact. And so we will start our presentation. So you will start your presentation in the row that we introduced you. So Emily, the floor is yours.
Just a few words, if I may. I would also like to say a few words of gratitude to the other partners. I mean, the Maidan Museum that helped us to organize this conference as well. Not conference, but presentation. And we worked together in many projects connected with the arts of Maidan. So I would like to mention them as well. They have done a huge work and they continue to do it, especially these days before the forthcoming anniversary. Okay, thank you. So Emily, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much to the organizers of this for putting everything together. Thank you, Jessica, especially for the invitation. And I'm so pleased to be here with Sophia as well. As many people know that we talk about this a lot. So it's great to be in the company of others who care so much about this particular moment in Ukraine's recent history. So I want to add also, obviously I'll talk about my book and Sophia's book is on its way out. But I will add that I have recently reviewed articles and manuscripts also about Maidan. This is a moment in history that is still really productive for social scientists. And it's also still producing the kind of cultural production that we all know is really essential. And I think that this is really just it's incredible that this moment is something that obviously Ukrainians don't forget, but others around the world know how important it is. And so I'm really happy to be here talking on this particular day, but also I'm glad that events like these are kind of creating more conversation about Maidan because it's such an important moment. And there's, in my view, there's no such thing as the definitive publication about Maidan. And that's something that I say because I experienced this protest movement through a very particular lens. And that was through the lens of these student feminist and leftist activists that I worked with. So I want to talk a little bit about my research and how the book is put together, and just a little bit about this important perspective to recognize the essential role of the activists that I worked with in the protests. I did my PhD in sociocultural anthropology, so my research was all ethnographic. So I arrived in Ukraine in September of 2013 to do 10 months of research as a Fulbright scholar. And I was working with student activists who were active and engaged in higher education activism. So looking at higher education reform in particular. And of course, a couple of months into the research that I had begun, these mass protests started. And so I ended up going to the protests nearly every single day from end of November of 2013 until I left Ukraine at the end of June of 2014. And so all these photos are my own, and the scope of the importance of these events covers, not just the beginning or the part in February, but the book presents the context of what was happening to bring self-organization in particular as the main takeaway from these protest events. So when I talk about self-organization, what do I mean? If something needs to be done and a person has the ability to do it, then they should simply do it. And so this idea is basically that there's no need to wait for somebody else to fix your problem for you. That if you have the ability to do it, you should do it yourself. This is something, it's kind of, I don't want to say funny, but it's interesting to just see now how this definition has taken off in Ukraine. Everybody knows what self-organization is and what a self-organized response is. And I firmly believe that Maidan, well, maybe not the exact origin, because if we look throughout Ukraine's history, there's lots of examples of self-organized events and protests and all of that. But I think that in 2014, self-organization becomes the main way that people associate with one another, with other citizens, but also with the people representing them, the state. That's what I'll talk about next. And what's really essential is that self-organization can disconnect political participation from existing political structures. And that means that you don't have to be part of a political party to be engaged in politics. This is especially helpful in the wake of the other post-independence protest movement in 2004, the Orange Revolution, which is very much organized around existing political figures and existing political representation. And I think one of the key shifts from Euromaidan is that these protests are obviously about President Yanukovych at the time, but they are not trying to replace Yanukovych with somebody else in particular. The political move is to criticize the fact that he does not represent Ukrainians as a whole. And so this opens up the space for political participation to criticize the consolidation of power and money in the hands of the state. So when I talk about this idea of the state, I draw from an anthropological conception of the state, in which we're not talking about a state taking an action, right? We have to think about who is part of the state. So I define the state as the actors and institutions that have the governing power within a territory. So this means that the bodies and the individuals who make up the state can change over time. That means that people who live in a state have a different association with the people who make up the state depending on a given time. And it also means that the power that the bodies that make up the state have changes over time depending on economic, political, and social factors. So when we look at 2013, this photo is taken in January of 2014, but when we look at the years that, 2010 to 2013, 2014, the way that Ukrainians relate to Yanukovych over that amount of time, as they see the Ukrainian state that he represents turning more strongly toward Russian economic institutions, Russian political institutions, becoming increasingly more authoritarian in ways that mimic the Russian state, that creates the space for Ukrainian citizens who do not want to live in an autocratic state to find new ways to criticize the representatives of the state. And that really comes to the head in 2014, starting in 2013, when Yanukovych makes the decision not to sign the association agreement. This moment is a catalyst for these protests to begin, but it's also very emblematic of the ways that President Yanukovych no longer represents the people who elected him. So why did I do this research with leftist activists in particular, other than the fact that I was connected with him already because of the types of student organizing I was looking at? They used this idea of self-organization and connected it with socialist ideas about self-help and global anti-capitalist movements. And so when leftist activists were criticizing the state, they weren't only criticizing the figure of Yanukovych himself or the intent of Yanukovych to move toward the Eurasian Customs Union, but they're actually critical of the ways that politicians in Ukraine were consolidating wealth and turning it into political power. So they're critical of the accumulation of wealth in the hands of those who are already wealthy because of the ways that that preserves political power in the hands of those who already have it. And so what I think is important to clarify here is that many of these activists at the time when these protests began did not support Ukraine's reintegration into any sort of Russian sphere of influence, whether that be the Eurasian Customs Union or any other idea. They were generally more supportive of a European future for Ukraine, but they were also critical of the European Union because they understood that European integration would lead to certain kinds of challenges for Ukraine that would place Ukraine in an economically marginal position to the main actors in the European Union, such as Germany and France. And so I think, especially in the early wake of these protests, it was a common misperception that leftist activists actually were nostalgic for the Soviet Union, despite the fact that most of them never lived in it. But that's very much untrue. And it's really important to recognize that these leftist voices were very essential in the path that the protests took, because it shows a multiplicity of voices, which is in fact a very democratic way that these protests were formed. You could have a lot of different political viewpoints and still believe that self-organization was the best way to go about challenging the state to become more representative. And so for this reason, I think it's really essential to make sure that these leftist voices and feminist voices, who in this image you can see are kind of calling out the marginalization of feminism as, which is obviously very common in Ukraine in 2013, pointing out that feminism is something that's very widely accepted across the European Union. Feminist voices, leftist voices, these were really essential parts of the protests, even if they maybe weren't the most dominant voices. So like I said, we know that the protests go from this very European-oriented idea to a criticism of the state as a whole that really asks citizens to shift how they're seeing the state. And I think that in the book, one of the main narratives that I use to tell about this shift from Europe to being about the state is this exploration of the language of the police state. Obviously, here you can see the role of the police in protecting the main part of Maidan from protesters. This is on December 1st of 2013 in the morning. So this is just after the square has been cleared of student protesters. And so this is a very, this is when we start to see these actors, these police actors who represent the state as being understood as representatives of the state. And so throughout the protests, leftist activists that I worked with use this language of standing against the police state. And they created several banners that had this type of language. And my favorite part of this story is this banner, "We are against a police state," that ends up hanging outside of the occupied Kiev City Hall. This picture is taken in March of 2014, but I think I first saw it there. I'd have to go back to my photos, but I think I first saw it there in later December. And so this is a banner that, it has no identifying political party-oriented or party ideology or political ideology language, right? You can't tell if it's from a leftist group, a right-wing group, a feminist group, right? There's no identifying information, but the sentiment that we are against a police state, it really tells us how this idea of criticism of the state and movement away from existing political parties, existing political ideologies, these kind of unifying ways of seeing and identifying the problem was what really brought protesters together. And I love this story of the banner because I went to a conference in December of 2014 or later 2014, and somebody else was doing a presentation about Maidan and had a photo of this banner in the occupied city hall and was sitting here talking about this idea of, we're against a police state, and this presenter had absolutely no idea where the banner had come from. And again, so the fact that she had no idea that it was a leftist banner, the fact that, for her it was emblematic of Maidan, it really tells us how important some of these voices that maybe we would think of as politically marginal, they became really central because of the way that they talked about the state and the police as representing the state. So I just think that this moment, this understanding of how different voices came together, I think it's ironic a little because it was really easy in the years between 2014 and maybe 2021 to become kind of cynical about the protests because so much of what people hoped would change in Ukraine was maybe not so different. Whereas now I think when we look back at these moments, we see a really distinctive shift. We see the protests as democratic, multivocal. We see people as figuring out different ways to make demands on the state for what they want and how they think the state should represent them. And then we also see the reforms done in Ukraine from 2014 to 2021 as key reforms in strengthening Ukraine's democratic institutions, which we now also see we're far further along on some path toward European integration than we might have thought if we were looking at this in 2020, for example. And we really see the role of self-organization as a unifying concept that people in Ukraine can really get behind. And when people inevitably ask about, why did Ukraine have such a different trajectory after independence than Russia or than Belarus, and I think the answer is in self-organization. And it's simply this idea that people are not going to sit around and wait for somebody else to do what needs to be done. That was true in 2014. That was true in the reform period in between 2014 and the full-scale invasion. And it is absolutely true now from 2022. Self-organization is what has been behind Ukraine's success in this war. And I think that that is this intangible thing. It's very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to understand why self-organization works so well. But if we look at this event from the recent past of Euromaidan, I think we start to see why it means so much to people, why self-organization was so effective. And I will go ahead and stop there, but I'm very happy to answer more questions about the book, but also I hope that people will think about these three publications in relationship with one another, because I think the conversation that they're having is really about creating this kind of multivocal, multi-perspective way of looking at Ukraine's recent past. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to address our audience. Please don't hesitate to leave your questions in the comments under this stream, and I'm sure that our speakers will answer them at the end of these presentations. So please be active. And Sophia, the floor is yours. You're welcome.
All right, thank you so much again for inviting me, as it is an honor to present here and also in such a great company. As Emily mentioned, me and her, and also us and Jessica, right, we've been having these fascinating conversations about this fascinating event that, as I described, changed not only Ukrainian history, but had profound effects on global history. So I wanted to thank Canadian Ukrainian Studies Fund that enabled my research, and as well I would like to offer special gratitude for the Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, where as all the images in this presentation and also in my book, in my forthcoming book, were provided by the museum, by the Maidan Museum. So thank you very much for that. So I look at the Maidan revolution as a political scientist, but very importantly, as I will show in my presentation, I found it through my years of study. So I conducted over 100 interviews with the revolutionaries in 2014, 2015, and then some follow-up interviews in 2016. And I analyzed legal documents, and there are fantastic collections of interviews that were done in Ukraine, published by Duche I Litera, as well as Ukraine's National Museum of Memory. So I tried to incorporate all of those interviews, and throughout the years of study, I discovered how important it is for us, to political scientists, to incorporate anthropological perspectives. I see it as a disconnect, and an unfortunate one, because it is specifically anthropological approach that I think helps us to see the social discourse that took place between all the participants, but also very importantly between state and society, and how it affected the way that revolution developed and also the changes that followed. So my first very important point that I would like to start with is that there's been a discussion a lot on whether or not the Revolution of Dignity, or as I refer to it simply as Maidan, as that's how revolutionaries talked about it in the interviews, whether indeed it was a revolution. And so in common Western media coverage, as well as many scholars, in fact, who don't study it in depth, refer to those events as simply as pro-EU protests. But what I show through my extensive study, that first of all, it was much more than just protests. It was these very extensive social networks that were created during the Maidan Revolution that helped maintain that revolution. It was court battles that were happening at the same time as the protests. So it was much more of a complex phenomenon of a social movement that turned into a true revolutionary movement as it succeeded at changing political regime. So classical definition of a revolution has two components: a mass movement and a regime change, right? If we see a mass movement that does not bring a regime change, it's simply a revolt. We do see, obviously, the first one is much easier for people to see, as there were approximately 4 million people who participated and millions more who supported this revolution. And again, it led to this grassroots movement, and not that was much more than just protests. But very importantly, what we are forgetting often is specifically the element of the regime change. We are ignoring sometimes, or say Western media ignoring quite often, that during those winter months, it turned into an authoritarian regime, hardcore authoritarian regime. It was enabled by all the preparation that was done by Yanukovych after he came to power. And in just those few years, it enabled the political institutions that were functioning during the winter months of 2013, 2014. The political institutions, including laws, judicial rulings, and law enforcement behavior, became of true authoritarian nature. It included January 16th laws that were restrictive of freedoms of expression, freedom of protest, freedom of the press. I pay special attention to the court trials that were happening, and there we see blatant violations of due process. They were literally, some trials lasted for 2 minutes, where all the rights of the defendants were neglected. Now, we know that there was a corruption in the Ukrainian courts, but previously, but what we see during those events is completely different. This has now turned into these blunt violations of due process under the directive of the state that is now functioning as an authoritarian state. And what is more commonly known, but I pay very special attention, is the police violence, illegal use of weapons, such as throwing flashbang grenades at people and injuring them, that then was also accompanied by torture and mockery, and then eventual use of live ammunition and snipers, that was very much in violation of existing states, but shows the full picture of this authoritarian state. And it is this truly authoritarian state of Yanukovych regime that was then, with the ousting of the Yanukovych and his team, that stopped existing after Maidan won. As after the victory, Ukraine went back to being a democracy with free and fair elections, with free press and freedom of expression. So the revolution of dignity won back Ukrainian democracy and stopped the function of authoritarian state. And therefore, this was a true regime change. All right, so I also, as I say, rely on anthropological and sociological approaches, and I show that Maidan became a state-society dialogue. I'm so sorry. It was a dialogue between the state and multiple social groups in the attempt to renegotiate social contract, right? To rewrite social contract, and while the state was trying to assert the new terms of legality, where the state was allowed to control to control society and limit their rights, so social groups were pushing back and not allowing adaptation of these new terms of legality. Now, what is interesting when I bring up that concept of dialogue, some people say, well, dialogue ends when violence starts. And here I rely on the scholarly literature of communicative violence. We need to remember that violence is also a message. Violence, state violence that is directed against its citizens is very much a message. It's not just meant to hurt or kill that person, as was done on Maidan. The most important, most importantly, it comes with a message. It is meant as a threat to everybody else, that this is what is going to happen to you if you do what others have done in this resistance. And with that message of a threat, the state attempts to assert new rules. So it is a very important message. And therefore, it is part of a dialogue of this negotiation about social contract. And now social protest and the court battles are also a message to the state. It is a message of social rejection of these new state rules that are being imposed. So it turns into a discourse about rights. And so state repression that was targeted against people is interpreted in certain ways, as it was interpreted in Maidan. In different parts of the world, state suppression might be interpreted differently, but in this given context, it was interpreted as an attempt to rewrite social contract, and therefore social response was a revolutionary movement. So therefore, Maidan revolution is a process, is a constant process of negotiation through violent and non-violent actions that serves as a message to each other, that serves as messages to each other. And it's a process of negotiation of social contract. So one quick example that and I have sort of millions of them in the book, but here's something, just one paragraph that I think is quite telling. One of the attorney who was defending those in courts who were actually trying to challenge the state when they were imprisoned, and they wanted to go further and appeal the cases. One of the attorneys said that I would always ask them the following question: neither you nor I can predict how long these repressions will last, 1 or 2 days or a month or years and decades, as in Belarus and Russia. Are you aware that as soon as you submit your application, you will be filed, you will be on the list? Do you understand that this expectation to win this legal battle is zero until the regime changes? Right? And then I said that this is what we need to do. So what we see here, and what I saw through multiple of these witness accounts, was full consciousness of the inability to punish the state offenders in that given legal environment. However, it's the continuous attempts to bring those cases to the court. We see that it was determination to break the system. So in other words, there is a quite large body of literature in political science on resource mobilization. And the emphasis there is that we are much more likely to see mobilization where there are resources. It's assumption that grievance is always there, but if you have more monetary resources, if you have more institutional resources, that's where we're more likely to see to see mobilization. So what I see from the example of Maidan is quite the contrary, that it's not just not having those political opportunities, specifically the courts here, as they refer to as legal opportunity structure. It is specifically because it's breaking down. And even though they know that at any given moment, they expect to fail, and yet they go on. So this was, so courts turn into then the arena of resistance. It was part of the Maidan movement to challenge the state and let them know that the new terms of legality are not going to be accepted. The same is true, was quite fascinating, that religious clergy, when they were talking about state abuses, they would talk about morality along the lines of constitutional rights. So they would say the state is wrong because it violated constitutional rights of citizens, and therefore it's immoral from the point of view of Christianity. And so this adaptation of their own terms of modality to the social discourse about constitutional rights, I found quite fascinating. And that's why I see mine and Emily's work kind of supporting each other, right? She's looking at a very different aspect of the feminist and leftist groups that are also negotiating their concepts with the rest of the group. I'm looking at other actors, and I came to the same conclusion, finding this fascinating discourse and negotiation. And that, in fact, and this was the root of the Maidan success, is ability to find a common ground among all these multiple ideological groups, from left to right, from feminist and religious, right, conservative ideology, and yet they found a common ground. They found common messages that then they used to battle the state. Therefore, the second, as they negotiate this with the state, as they challenge the state, what is quite fascinating is Maidan becoming a socialization process where the revolutionaries learn about each other, and they negotiate their values through the discourse about rights and belonging. Therefore, that process of social discourse, of revolutionary social discourse, is what then results in post-Maidan change that not only brings democracy back to Ukraine as a profound political change, but also contributes to social changes, to the changes in political and social culture. So through the process of this dialogue, participants in the revolution change their own notions of what it is, what does it mean to be Ukrainian, what does the word nation mean, and most importantly, what is civic duty. And that, it is therefore how I show, so through this I show the mechanism of how Maidan changed. There are lots of studies now that show, that talk about post-Maidan changes, and my attempt is to show why this happened, right? Not only to show that after Maidan we see changes, but to show the mechanism of this change, how getting up and, as Emily right, discovers this process of, this process of self-organization. We have to do it therefore we're going to do it. And similarly, I discovered through interviews of this new appearance of volunteer culture. And that is the mechanism that helped those participants and those who observed them to overcome the legacies of a totalitarian system that continued for decades. And that's what scholars found, where the society was expecting the state to deliver and for somebody else to do it. And that somewhat what differs, not somewhat, very much what differs Maidan from the Orange Revolution, or Revolution of Dignity from the Orange Revolution, because after the victory, all the expectations fell on the state, on Yushchenko to deliver all those changes, versus through Maidan and through all these self-organizations, their participants found that it is their own responsibility, that democracy means, and it's rethinking the concept of democracy, right? That they discovered that democracy, first and foremost, means their own participation. If they don't challenge the state and its actions to repress, nobody will do it for them. So I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you so much. And just before giving the floor to Jessica, I would like to add some information, because her book Superfluous Women is really prize-winning book, and it has received a lot of different awards. Among them are the ones I'm going to mention. So these are the award from Canada Shevchenko Society, Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, the Association of Women in Slavic Studies, University of Toronto Mount School Award of School of Global Affairs, Patriotic Foundation, and the University of Michigan Institute for Research on Women and Gender, as well as the award from Modern Language Association Honorable Mention, and Emilian Pritsak Prize Honorable Mention. And at the end of the year 2022, it received the book prize from American Association for Ukrainian Studies. By the way, the Polish translation of the book was published in 2023, and the Ukrainian translation of this book is going to be published in 2024. So quite soon, I suppose, in a few months, probably. Okay, thank you, ladies. And Jessica, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to the discussion.
Thank you, Oksana. One minor correction. The Polish edition is going to be published in April. And I'm really excited about it because the publisher, Muzeum Sztuki Nowoczesnej in Warsaw, the Museum of Modern Art, is having a big exhibit of Ukrainian focus art that same month. So it's going to be in the context of a lot of different events. And I would like to mention the Soniak initiative in Warsaw, which is really important for Ukrainian culture and its relation with Eastern Europe. Many of the artists at Museum of Modern Art often say that that is one of the best museums in all of Europe for Ukrainian art, because the museum has for many years been collecting and exhibiting Ukrainian art. And there will be pieces by Maria Primachenko, whose home museum was hit by a Russian missile this year. So thank you everybody for participating in this panel. I'm learning a lot. I would like to share my screen. Let's see, just a minute, and here we are. And trying to go to the slideshow. Let's see.
The full screen.
Here we go. There we go. So I'm going to shift the conversation just a little bit to the roles of culture and gender, primarily in Maidan, and also a little bit after Maidan. So I have two books here, and one of them, the one with the face, is an anthology that I edited and was published just this year. And the drawing on this particular book is an artwork by the Ukrainian contemporary artist Lesa Homenko. And it is her work from her participation on Maidan, in which she was sketching individually the faces of everybody that she met and spoke with on Maidan, and did so on paper over a carbon block. So this is a kind of palimpsest of many different faces on Maidan. I also really love this artwork of hers because this face ends up being a little bit androgynous, which I think is interesting from the perspective of the conversations and the activism that I'm going to foreground today, stretching a little bit before Maidan and a little bit after Maidan. So here, just to kind of prologue, the rest of the discussion is a memorial on the Maidan in 2018. I imagine that we are one day away from the official remembrance of the Heavenly Hundred, and I would like to just respectfully note that probably Maidan looks similar to what we see here today with candles, etc., in their honor. And this is an image from the actual Maidan during the protests. Already memorials were put up. That was on Easter that I took this photo of the barricade. My book really looks at intergenerational experiences of revolution and war, how younger culture makers, we might say influencers in the world of social media, although I don't look at my actors in my book from that perspective, they were really interested in discussing what the Soviet legacy meant for their own futures and thinking through some of the ways to prevent the traumas and issues from the past, as well as experiences of, especially in looking at gender mothers and grandmothers, they wanted to take with them into the future and rebuilding of Ukraine. Many of the people in my book took part in the Orange Revolution, so they remembered those experiences and were disappointed by much of the outcome. And on the Maidan, were very hopeful in looking for alternative histories to how the Soviet regime and the institutions, as Emily has so beautifully written about in her book, with educational institutions in particular, the students were very important on Maidan, and the younger generations being a part of their schools and universities primarily saw Maidan through this lens, through the institutions, the education that they wanted to adapt to their future, to their ideas. So a lot of the concerns in the discussions that I had in writing this book over the period 2008 to 2020 when it was published, so several years, a lot of those conversations, me being more of a cultural historian, I'm not a social scientist, they really, a lot of personal conversations about families, about things that, the younger generation saw in terms of concern for class conflicts, for labor, for hiring equality. And in fact, in 2011, a very important group called Ofensiva, calling themselves Feministyczna Ofensiva, formed. This was a self-proclaimed feminist group, and they reignited the March 8 Women's March. And this Women's March at that time only had about 20 people in it, but now, has since grown to 3,000 and is an international event involving a lot of different components, not all of them fighting only for women's rights, but also for the values of human rights and for membership in the EU. And this, I will talk about a little bit more also, becomes important because the role of intellectuals, the role of culture, the role of the educational institutions in which students were working, but also not only students, established artists, established authors, is important for Maidan because these are the languages with which people inhabit their civic identities, their civic languages, and a lot of the emphasis in the artworks, in the activism, was about autonomy from the state, as Emily has pointed out in her work as well. And I also am here showing you a historical photo from 2014 that was created on the Maidan by another artist, Nikita Kadan. This one showing fallen Lenin's statue, Lenin's head, as repurposed as a barricade. So one of the key aspects of the nation making among the younger generation is not erasing Soviet history, but repurposing it, as you can see here, re-identifying it. And this is important not only in the visual texts, but the written texts and the public spaces in which young people were on the Maidan and actively participating in it. A lot of art was also being created on the Maidan by new emerging artists or non-professional artists. But here I'm looking in particular at individuals who already for 10 years before Maidan happened were working as artists in the spheres of the institutions that make culture and that produce culture, which is a little bit different than creating art, you know, in situ or spontaneously. That is a little bit different. So in terms of the institutions that were already very important inside Ukraine for art, obviously you have National Academy of Art of Ukraine, the national museums, but you had a biennial, the Kiev Biennial, which was united with several different biennales around Eastern Europe, and they were working, you know, in each other's countries in global ways, looking at things also inclusive of urban planning, in redesigning the Soviet era spaces to make them more accessible. And these included, again, the values of the younger generations wanting to change and adapt their own experiences and not, you know, just inhabit the Soviet era design spaces. One of the great activists that I and artists that I had a chance to really get to know is Yevgenia Belorusets, and I write about her photography extensively in my book. She has since published an award-winning diary called War Diary, which may be interesting for German audiences because she writes in German as well. She's a native speaker, near native speaker of German as well as Ukrainian and also Russian. And I think it's very interesting that she and many authors are polyglot and publishing in multiple languages because their polyvalence and their ideas become more expansive as they're expressing them in various languages. And her work in particular in this photo was inside of a former Soviet tenement home. So apartment complex created for low-income housing. It was a Soviet era, a temporary housing for the revolution that then became a tenement home in the post-Soviet space. So it was in Kyiv being used for low-income housing, and it was primarily women who were living there. Sarah Phillips has written great work about the 1990s and also the feminization of poverty and the resilience of women to navigate their roles in society. So Yevgenia Belorusets in this work was photographing women over several years living in this structure and also documenting the activism around this structure in order to reclaim this particular building and make it a better dwelling for lower income individuals. And she was using the aesthetics of the Soviet official artist, Alexander Rodchenko from the 1920s, one of the most famous I will note that the images that I have from the Pushkin State Museum of Russia in the new edition of my book will not be credited to them. They are not going to receive a penny for publishing their archival photos because they don't belong only to the Pushkin National State Museum. Rodchenko is working extensively throughout Ukraine. And what is interesting then here about the visual language of culture makers in Ukraine during pre-Maidan and even now is this total re-identification and interrogation of Soviet official aesthetics and Soviet realism. I'll give you Soviet socialist realism. I'll give you some more examples of that. But I want to just note a few of the different aspects or maybe more social functions of the role of gender, joining the local with the global. So these women and pride marches were also important for connecting collectives of women like Feministyczna Ofensywa with those in nearby countries such as Poland and Belarus. And in my anthology that I showed you with the cover having the face on it, there are 6 contributing authors from Poland and 4 from Belarus, and all of them are working in culture and history and cultural history in the idiom of the history of women and gender. One of them in particular, Agnieszka Grof, is a very well-known Polish figure and a symbol in her own work of feminism. But what she writes about what happened in Poland in 2021 with the Black protests throughout the country is that it is a community of the imagination, a revolution of image, text, and song, a certain language of expression. She proposes a question: who is this newly emergent female subject that speaks to the so-called female people? Why am I talking about Poland? Because what happened in Poland and Belarus later, more recently, 2020, 2021, shows a pattern of alignment between women's marches, pride marches, activism within LGBT communities and feminists, so self-identifying feminist communities. I'm not labeling anyone feminist, they call themselves feminists. A total alignment with opposition, and even a driver ahead of opposition forces to state tyranny in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. Lukashenko's regime has been challenged primarily by women, and also the protests in Poland, the Black protests of feminists for the abortion rights that they were arguing for, were the largest mass protests in Poland since 1989. So these are not marginal groups. These are central events. And inside Ukraine's Maidan, the outcomes of the gender activists have become more and more visible vis-a-vis the legislation inside Russia to outlaw gay propaganda, to criminalize homosexuality, to target and censor any books or images that have to do with gender rights. Here you see in 2020, the Kyiv Pride March couldn't take place because of the pandemic, and instead activists took a drone and flew the rainbow flag over the motherland statue, again, a symbol of Soviet heritage that is now being re-identified in ways in which not only young people, but many people in Ukraine fought for on Maidan to align with the values of the EU, which the EU itself has been fighting to keep against Kremlin disinformation campaigns like the Yellow Jackets, like the anti-gay homophobic reactions against gay Europa, and all of the other evidences we've seen, especially in countries like Poland that are even more proximate to Russia, the Kremlin disinformation that that continues to provoke the idea of gay rights as being only leftist, because they're not only on the left in a political spectrum, there are conservative gays, but there's also this idea that gay and LGBT, where all of these individual words for self-identification can be weaponized by the Kremlin. So here we see the Kiev Pride March keeping alive the streets of Kiev after the Maidan, and not only with activists, but also ambassadors and diplomats from across the EU joining these marches and endorsing them to provide protection for the activists themselves. Within the cultural creations coming out of Maidan, we have amazing cultural ambassadors like Vlada Rauko for Ukraine. This is her series of paintings called Kievsky Shodenik, Kiev Journal, and many of them also depict war. She was living between Kiev and Kaniv, the birthplace of Taras Shevchenko at the time, and creating lots of sketches. She's very inspired by Taras Shevchenko's drawings. And some of them, like this one, reflect on grandmothers and women's experience of the passage of time and the passage of the generations within the context of revolution, and their grandmothers' memories of the 1917 revolution and what it symbolized being completely different from her own generation. Again, Lisa Homenko in her work here draws upon Soviet socialist realists' idealizations of the Soviet peasant from the bygone revolution, but does so in a way that criticizes what the failures of that revolution were, in showing here the Ukrainian flag as the backdrop, the sky over the wheat field. She incorporates now also into her work in relation to the war a lot of commentary about the Soviet past in the underpinnings of what's happening in the war today, that there are still Soviet legacies alive and strong in Russia, in which the artists and the interlocutors here have been very much critical of. Here are just a few more images I wanted to draw your attention to, because I wanted to make even stronger this connection between global and local, and not only in the region of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, but also with the United States in the idioms of cultural expression in Ukraine. So here is a photograph by Evgenia Belarusets inside of a textiles factory in Kyiv. And you can see the blue marks on the wall, a significant marker of public spaces in Ukraine that is also a legacy of the Soviet past in the design of public space and the demarcation of state-controlled spaces. So she does also an amazing job with portraiture, and really has captured not only the lives of women, but the lives of many in Ukraine in recent years in the context of the war as well. She's working actively in Kyiv, even amid everything that is happening there. And the emphasis on textiles, a traditional element, usually in women's cultural production and women's art, going back to the folk tradition of the Ukrainian vyshyvanki, appears also in works by Valentina Petrova. This is her piece, Self-Portrait, in which she created a beautiful modernist portrait of herself and then erased it. So it was a performance, even as much as it was also the creation of an art object. And Sofia Tokar in Prague created an apron with Google searches about how to find a Ukrainian housemaid. This is what she was commenting on, was the labor relations between Ukraine and EU at the time, and the overwhelming abundance of lower paid labor from Ukrainian women in Prague. So this was her commentary on that, but there are also other comments outside of the more sociocultural relations and inequalities that are tethered to the opposition aspects that I was talking about earlier in the more direct critiques of the oppressive regimes that have been in place, such as Lukashenko's regime. Rufina Bazlova, who's a very well-known artist from Belarus, has created many textiles with images on them, such as protesters facing police lines, also trucks. These really resemble what was happening on Maidan, but this is another location. This is Minsk, and we see the parallel here in the also particular artists' rendering of Ukrainian and also, in this case, Belarusian folk art to utilize the aesthetics of the folk in order to criticize the regime. And that is something that happened a lot also on Maidan, using a lot of signs and symbols and icons connected to Ukrainian folk art. Why? Because also in the 1920s, artists would be killed for making such images, such vyshyvanki, or anything that could be connected to the national question or any idea of nation outside of the USSR. So it's also a historical reference to the late 20s and 30s, in which Stalinism attacked and executed, in the executed Renaissance, as it's called, executed Ukrainian artists in mass for creating or expressing autonomy. So using these symbols again in the context of protests against state tyranny is a communication among artists, but not only artists. It's recognizable by a wider public, much wider public, that this regime equals an oppression of our speech and of our national past that we want to carry into the future, outside of any kind of discussions about national languages. These images, just like Bazlova has created here, are recognizable in Poland, in Belarus, in Ukraine. There's no translation needed between Polish, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and that's what makes the women's and pride marches and the global elements through the gender lens such a unifying and important force in combating also Kremlin disinformation, which completely erases and outlaws any expression of LGBT rights, or, as I mentioned before, criminalizes homosexuality. So here you see also great senses of humor, like the dead cockroach as a parallel to Lukashenko. I'll just skip forward. I wanted to mention one more connection before I will stop and we can have questions. This is the very well-known art piece, The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago, currently in New York, where it is held permanently in Brooklyn, actually, and was created in the 1970s as part of a outpouring in the US of feminist and pro-women's history and art connected with commentary on the body, the role of the body in relation to power and in relation to politics and political regimes, including comments about abortion and rape and a lot of human rights issues now that are also coming to the forefront in the context of the war in Ukraine. Here you see on each place a very well-known woman from the past. So, for example, Joan of Arc is represented in one particular place setting. and a Georgia O'Keeffe style plate with a flower on it, likely representing a vagina. So she's using a lot of art, and this is historical references in her artwork to the classics, neoclassics. And she brought together whole collectives of women to create these pieces, just like the culture makers in Ukraine on and after Maidan. They're bringing a lot of people together, also in the context of war, in order to continue the expression of Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian autonomy that Putin would like to erase. Here you can see Valentina Petrova, the artist who I showed earlier, who made the self-portrait. She writes, a stylish and elaborate dinner party consisting of gourmet dishes from the world's best, luxuriously served at a reasonable price. So she, the Ukrainian artist, created her own Judy Chicago dinner party in Kiev, and she made here, you can see lots of different exotic dishes, and she really was making them like in person. So it was a performance involving a lot of people, and I know it's interesting to talk more about that, but we have to conclude. And I'll just conclude with Vlada Rauko's piece, Strawberry Andreevna, 2014, which she made for her friend, Alevtina Kakhidze, whose mother passed away in Donbass, in occupied Donbass, very early on in the war, I believe in 2016 or 2017. She was a pensioner living there, and her daughter, the artist Alevtina Kakhidze, called her Strawberry Andreevna, made her protagonist in her series, and so Vlada Rauko is making here a kind of gesture to the other artist. So there's a lot of this that happens in Ukrainian art, a lot of intertextuality and communication in that way, but it's also a respectful wave to the mother and also grandmother's experiences in Ukraine. Here, the red carnation obviously is passe as any kind of expression, but it's re-identified here and reworked into an exact interrogation of what that past means, what that Soviet underpinning of culture can become as a resource for autonomy rather than a burden or trauma, working through that trauma instead. So that is all for my presentation. I will stop here so we can have questions and discussion.
Yes, so as far as I know, Emily, Sophia, and Jessica were going to pose questions to each other. So let's probably start with these questions, and then we'll move forward to the questions from our audience. Rina. Okay, so ladies, do you have any questions to each other? No?
I do.
Okay, Jessica, you're welcome.
I would love to ask Emily a little bit more about the students and their role in the protests, and which universities, or what the outcomes now are for some of the actors maybe that you interviewed for your book in the context of the war. Has there been progress, or what are some of the challenges? I'd just be interested to hear what the status is with the chapter on education.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, so the student activist groups that I was working with since 2012, actually, I was working with a group called Pramadia, which is direct action. So this is a group that was really active in the late 2000s and then kind of had a dip and then kind of came back around in 2012, 2013, 2014, had another kind of post-Maidan dip. They are really active again now. You can follow them on Telegram. They have a really robust channel. They post all the time, which is amazing. One of the things whenever I'm talking to audiences that don't know that much about Ukraine, as I tell them that, despite full-scale invasion, people are really still working on major democratic reforms that they were fighting for, and that includes in the realm of higher education. It's an interesting thing to follow student activism because students aren't students forever. And so I think the kind of like sustainability of student activism can be a real challenge, because people tend, you know, they work on a project that is related to their particular concerns at the time, and then they have to move on. They're sort of forced to move on, which is of course what happened actually in one of the pictures from Valentina Petrova's dinner party. There are some of those activists are in that picture, but you know, a couple of years past their graduating, and obviously, you know, integrated in other things. So I think what's especially interesting is that this group Pramedia, at the time that I end up doing my research, they end up being much more integrated with other leftist, feminist, LGBTQ activist trends. Whereas when I had planned this research in 2012, they were really integrated in student activism and working with other student groups at that time. So organizations like the Foundation of Regional Initiatives and VICIC were the other two not leftist groups that they were really engaged with. And it's really interesting, you know, the way these protests changed accessibility to different political goals for people. Obviously, we know that one of the big stories of Maidan is that students were a key actor in very early, you know, February 23rd. They're the ones who were there. They're the ones who are first repressed by the riot police. And I think so. It's, I mean, the landscape of student activism is as broad as ever, I think, is the answer to the question, because student activism is both extremely immediate. It's very much about, you know, higher education, but it's also very much about the world we want to live in. And that's why students get so integrated on Maidan, but that's also why student activism remains so robust right now. And obviously, you know, one of the European integration of Ukraine's higher education has been a key, you know, active. That's one of the key reforms. So this is probably of interest to this audience. I have a photo archive of about 3,000 photos from Maidan, which are currently being categorized and will eventually be accessible through Miami University of Ohio, which is a place I did my postdoc fellowship, where I'm working with students to kind of categorize them. And one of the things I'm finding is flags from universities. So Kyiv Mohyla, Kyiv Polytechnic, Kyiv National University, Lviv National University, Lviv Polytechnic. So actually, instead of answering that question, I think I'll say, check back this photo archive a few months from now, and you can find the names of every university, which is just going to go back and show this you know, way that Maidan was so multivocal, so democratic. And also go follow Pramedia on Telegram and check out what they're working on.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Emily. Okay, any other questions to each other?
I would be curious to hear Sophia talk a little bit more. I know you've done a lot of work in like the legal realm of this, and I think it's so fascinating because it's one of those parts of the protest that's like not in the public sphere. It's sort of behind the scenes. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what you talked about and why you think that this kind of legal component is such an important part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. There was, I think one of the most important thing is, of course, that this was, while not known so much to others, and Maidaners knew that this was happening, Maidaners meaning the revolutionaries, but that's one of the major dialogues between the state that I could trace, and it was specifically addressing the problem of Yanukovych's regime becoming hardcore authoritarian and imposing those terms of legality, overriding the social contract. So here we can see, here's the law, here's constitutional rights, here how they would defend it for years. And then the lawyers told me that during those months, the behavior of judges and what it meant for the defendants completely changed. Right? right, practically overnight. So courts, Ukrainian courts during those months were completely different, and it really captured the authoritarian nature, the telephone law of the Soviet era, where you can see something on the paper, where rights are provided on the paper, but what really mattered was the Yanukovych administration folks giving a call to the judges, who would then bluntly suppress the rights. Right, it was fascinating to learn about different trials that were going on. For example, lawyers said that at times it could last for just 2 minutes. At times, the defendant wasn't even present. They kept the defendant in jail, and they said, and the judges would blame the lawyers and said, well, that's a problem. We're going to find your defendant guilty because he didn't show up. And the lawyer said, he is in jail. It's your fault. He is not here, right? And then sometimes so what was interesting is even those dialogues and what I was trying to capture, that was pushing back. Sometimes the judge said, well, you cannot do it. I'm just taking your right as a lawyer away from you. You cannot defend the defense. So somebody else. And so then the lawyer would ridicule the judge quite openly, right? They knew it was risk for themselves, but they would start ridiculing the judge and said, well, that's in violation of so many procedural violations that you just exposing the rights and etc. So it was, first of all, appealing those cases that was a method to challenge the state. But even these dialogues between those attorneys and 500 attorneys did pro bono work during Maidan. It was the only time in the history of Ukraine where we see this cause lawyering movement, right? So the lawyers did volunteer work for the cause and defending those. And very often what they did, they knew they would lose, but they would just through making fun of the judges, they would expose what the state is doing. And they would also educate there, because most of people are not aware of what their rights are and what the legal ramifications are. And so what some of those who were defendants during Maidan told me, that lawyers would educate them and say, okay, the state is offering you a deal, but in that deal, you have to admit your guilt. Now, it is up to you. You can take it because that brings less threat to you for the future. But for the record, you are not guilty. The state is making you say that you're guilty, but you did not violate any laws. And so so they opened that discussion of what should we do. They said, here are your risks. And therefore, what should we do? Should we be challenging the state, or should we be taking those deals? So yes, thank you, Emily, for that question, because that was so fascinating to me, because it's in any discussion about the Maidan revolution, the court battles are left out and they're not discussed, but it captured so much of the essence of the Maidan, of fighting against that injustice and those authoritarian methods that were imposed by the state.
And I think it's so interesting the way it overlaps with how I think about the state as actors and institutions, right? It's another institution that's following a certain kind of state practice that citizens then find ways to fight against. And that's something, I mean, just to say, like, I'm an anthropologist, and so I studied mostly street protests, and Sophia comes in as a political scientist, you're more able to capture this other level that otherwise I think really would go unnoticed, much to our collective academic shame. It's so important. So I personally can't wait to read that part of your book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Emily. Okay, any other questions?
I do have a question for Jessica. So I was wondering, what do you think in your account of the book, what did you find the most profound effect of the Maidan on the artists and other activists?
A lot of despair and disappointment after Maidan. I think because the change, I mean, there were immediate gains for everyone that were very, very positive, such as visa-free travel regime. And that was probably the greatest and the most positive effect on culture for Ukraine, because so many artists and culture makers could travel easily to Europe and share their works in residencies and museum exhibits. And that was not possible before. So it served a great role for individuals, but also for the country to spread ideas and spread its dialogue about joining the EU with actual in-person exchanges in the EU. And what I mean by despair is the standards are so high among Ukrainians, higher than most of the EU these days. I've noted in what I've read by political scientists like Lucan Way, whose work I relied on in my book because your book wasn't out yet. But I think that the EU is also renewing itself by understanding and listening to Ukrainians, and in terms of the changes domestically in Ukraine, I think that a lot of people, it's safe to say, wanted more illustration after Maidan, wanted to know who the Berkut was by name, and also to ferret out the Kremlin influencers within the government, which we see are still even there today. And that's so hard to do. Anti-corruption work is ongoing on every level, and that also includes culture. And I think what artists found themselves in as Maidan slid later into war was this conundrum: do we work with Russian artists? Do we work in Ukrainian only, not in Russian, even though it's our native language? And these became very hard questions to answer. Also, the question of using violence or not for self-defense, because art and art in Ukraine has always had an immediacy that doesn't exist in the experience of art, let's say in the United States, in its relationship to official culture and the state stamp that you are an official artist, you are not. This, was the division between life and death, as I mentioned, in the 20s and 30s. So artists, I think, after Maidan really and continue to kind of question what is universal about culture and what is particular to an individual's experience, and how can we work together to create more peace and better experiences for audiences coming to our events, coming to the museums, without alienating individuals, but also recognizing that the role of Russian culture does play a colonizing role in the Kremlin's regime. And so there were very clear divisions between not working with artists from Russia who use any state money. There were, bans within collectives on publishing in Russian. There were some things that I think are still, ongoing, not only for Ukrainian artists, but also scholars who write about culture and Ukrainian history, and how, I'm sure both of you are also very much aware of this, leading institutions, leading people building institutions. How are we going to shape a future that is decolonized from Russian influence without completely erasing, individuals who are Russian, who maybe are fighting within that regime? As we know, the death of Alexei Navalny being one example of a gain for Putin's tyranny, and a loss for, the resistance to that tyranny. So I'm sure that there are no easy answers to these, but I look forward to hearing more and more from Ukrainian artists, scholars, and culture makers.
Thank you,
so
Jessica.
much.
And as far as I know, Rina has got some questions. So please.
Yeah, right, exactly. But first of all, I would like to say thank you so much for this amazing interdisciplinary presentations and all the work you have put into your books. Yeah, my first question could be about the decolonization, but I think Jessica answered it right now without even knowing that I wanted to ask it. But still, I have a question for all of you. And it is regarding the connotation of Maidan as unexpected revolution. But can you agree or rather disagree with this marking from your point of view? So weren't there signs probably that the revolution was coming and was needed, so was really necessary?
I can go first. So I guess the short answer would be not so much unexpected, and there are two sort of paradigms. One is, as Jessica talked about, the dichotomy between Ukrainian society and Russian society, and that is, of course, the very different attitudes toward the state, and most importantly, the democratic values that existed in Ukrainian society, as they were not burdened by the imperialist syndrome that existed in Russia. As we know, Putin is not the only one responsible. He had quite a bit of support from the population to promote this aggressive imperialistic project. And whenever you want to promote imperialism, you then are automatically sacrificing your own rights at home. So Ukraine didn't have that burden, but on the contrary, going back to decolonization, was which you started, for Ukrainian nation, a big part of a discourse was liberation from the Soviet Union, which brought Holodomor, which brought Chernobyl and the way it was covered up, etc. So Ukrainians were much more willing to say goodbye to the Soviet Union and move on, and successfully embraced democratic values that were only growing over time. So as Yanukovych's regime, and sort of in the first chapter of my book, I talk about the change to the constitution, the change to the and all the actions that Yanukovych was taking in order to tighten the grip on society. There was quite a bit of, and with the suppression of the freedom of expression and of protest and the press that was going on while Yanukovych was in power. So essentially, and they were, I talk about different resistant movements that were going on a smaller scale, including Vradiivka, right, and many others, Hostinny Dvir. So there were growing resistance movement, but essentially there was an agreement. And even at the end of November 2013, when they said we are done, the solution was we're going to wait till the elections. And as we're waiting for the elections, we're going to promote this discourse to make sure we vote Yanukovych out of power. But with the brutal aggression of the Yanukovych regime on the peaceful protesters, and then continuing police and judicial, etc., violence, then with time, people understood that they had no other choice. They believed that if Maidan would have failed, they would become another Belarus, or Russia in their own words.
And Sophia, I think that's such a good perspective. And I think actually combining the question about decolonizing this exact question is a really good example of why we need to not assess Ukraine by the standards of Russia, because by framing Ukraine as being like Russia, that's what makes Maidan unexpected and unpredictable. It's because we assume Ukrainians are going to behave like Russians, whereas all of us might have had a totally different assessment of this unexpected characteristic if we were assessing Ukraine based on anyone else, let alone based on its own history, which shows us a very strong predisposition toward using public protest to make claims on the state. And so I think, like, if you're talking about like me standing on Maidan and being like, what is happening? Yeah, very unexpected. But when we zoom out and take a bigger look, and especially when we take Ukraine on its own terms, it fits very much into the tactics that people would certainly use to make those kind of claims.
I also want to mention something that Luke Inway, the political scientist I mentioned earlier, has written about, and it is Ukraine as a normal country, normal case, fitting in with the rest of Europe in the rise of the far right after Maidan in that period. And a lot of critics of Maidan were always referencing the far right, but Russia didn't have the rise of the far right because Russia is already far right and producing the Kremlin disinformation throughout Europe, so that it's also one more example of why Ukraine fits within the European community, because of also sharing some of the same problems that Europe has had to face vis-a-vis the disinformation and the provocations of the far right that were happening on Maidan, but also happening throughout Europe in those years afterward. And studying feminism and gender in particular is valuable for looking at that lens, because the classical opponents of feminists and LGBT activists are the far right, and so you can really learn a lot about the structure of the two polarities within a society. And Agnieszka Graf, the Polish feminist I mentioned earlier, is researching and writing about the far right now, and has just published a really good book in Polish. I think it's being translated to English, about the far right in Poland, which has, I think, out of many countries in Europe, been one of the most vehement cases of anti-feminism and also anti-democracy movements.
Maybe another question that comes to mind, even though I have so many of them, but yeah, not to be too not to be too long, too boring. The question regarding continuity, I would say. So like my first one was more about the past, but my next one is more about the future from Maidan and our now present days that we have right now. That a couple of years ago, before the full-scale invasion, there was a banner near Maidan on the walking bridge on the Heroiv Nebesной Sotni street that said, Russia started war here. What do you think about it? And what do you think about this continuity of the process of Ukrainian showing their their Ukrainian word for it, vola, so their desire for freedom, and Russia being unable to accept it and taking this revenge with their attacks?
I can go first. So I mean, I absolutely agree with that in the way. So the last chapter of my book is analyzing the Russian propaganda about Maidan, and that it has actually strong elements of specifically promoting and provoking mass violence. So clearly Putin wanted to invade Ukraine right after, and he did. 2 days after the Maidan, and we clearly see the connection. Why? Because Putin, from him coming to power, quite openly was stating that Ukraine is not a state. And in his very early interviews, he talked about and glorified Russian imperialism and asserting Russian imperialism vis-a-vis Ukraine, saying that Russia has sort of the right to invade Ukraine. There were plans. Now it's open information that there were plans and discussion in the Kremlin to invade Ukraine after 2004 Orange Revolution, when Ukraine truly became democracy. And then, though, through Yanukovych, Putin found a way. First of all, Russian society wasn't quite ready for this, for these level of atrocities and for open invasion. But also through Yanukovych's regime, he then successfully was able to control Ukraine through this puppet regime. What the Revolution of Dignity truly showed is not only that Ukraine is back to democracy, but that Ukrainians are willing to risk their lives for democracy and freedom. So Putin understood that he lost Ukraine once and for all. And that is why he invaded in 2014 and in many ways failed, because only 2 coups succeeded in Donetsk and Lugansk that were aided by Russian security forces, but they failed in many other Ukrainian cities. And he didn't forget that, obviously. So the Russian atrocities, the genocidal war against Ukraine is explained by the fact that Putin knew he was not wanted. He knew that there would be resistance, and therefore destruction of the Ukrainian nation was for him the answer. So as the way I see it, there's a direct connection. We cannot deny it.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Tamara Khondrova, Dr. Tamara Khondrova. She has written that when she was writing an article on Maidan as a social cultural performance, she met some misunderstanding among her colleagues. To them, it was a kind of diminishing the role of Maidan. And she asks, what do you think about performative character of Maidan? So do you think it's a kind of diminishing?
I think anyone who is standing in support together is entitled to their individual performance of themselves, as long as they're in peace with others, gathered in nonviolent, peaceful protests. That was the argument of some of the dissenters within the feminist Offensiva group, that led to the split of that group on Maidan. That was like the biggest women's organization prior to that point, and they had founded the Women's March. And they split up on Maidan because some of them disagreed that others should use violent means. So there was disagreement among them. I think that in moments of crisis, of extreme stress, when the state is attacking you with violent means, people will respond differently. And I think in that response, what was happening on Maidan went, far beyond only individual performativity of identity, but it was actually fighting for one's identity and right to life. So I wouldn't discount anyone who is standing in those spaces under attack. So that would be my response. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Thank you. All right, and if I may, I would ask one more question, especially to what Jessica has said. Well, you have drawn a parallel between Ukraine and Belarus, and we know that there were a lot of different protests against the state tyranny in Belarus, and you have given great example of a similar artistic expression of the protest. But in your opinion, what do you think went wrong? Why the results are so different? Why didn't it work for them? I mean, those protests, they ended with nothing, and they still have the tyranny, even bigger, even more important these days. So what differs us, because the expressions were similar and the actions were similar, but the results are not similar at all?
Yes, I'm not drawing a parallel between Ukraine and Belarus, but I am bringing them together with Poland. Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus all involve very active women's movements fighting against tyrannical regimes. And I'm referring to Yanukovych regime in Ukraine's case in this sense. There are very different structures in the women's movement in Belarus, being that the primary three leaders, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, Veronika Tsepkalo, they are, standing in for their husbands who are in jail, and they make reference to this often, and they do not claim to be a women's movement in particular, as they claim to be an opposition movement, but it is primarily women-led, and was a lot of women participating in the Saturday marches there. The Belarusian scholars and writers who have written about this particular women's movement, and also activists that I spoke with in Kyiv in 2021 who were exiled from Lukashenko's regime, clearly felt that Ukraine was a much more democratic place where they could express themselves and even take refuge. And I would note here also the role of the pandemic, because the pandemic was happening at the same time, and a lot of the activists were working anyway in spaces, sharing spaces together in person, and were openly critical also of how Belarus dealt with the pandemic, and obviously co-opting it as a way to oppress and control populations. So yeah, I think that may have answered your question. I'm not sure if there's still any question left, but happy to continue.
Okay, so are there any questions, or should we stop here for today? Maybe you would like to tell a few words, probably Natalia. Yeah. We can't hear you, Natalia. Sorry, the microphone is off.
Dear colleagues, it was a really great pleasure to hear your presentations of your books, and I hope all of your books are for the moment, or will be soon, in the collection of Maidan Museum. It's our great partner, and of course we are asking for them to have your books there, and it's also a great honor that Maidan Museum gives us opportunity to share its collection for our presentations, for the books, and also we are waiting for a dissertation and a book of era to come soon, also to become a part of collection of Maidan Museum. Well, to tell the truth, 10 years were very quick, and Emily, I really appreciated you where maybe we met there because I was there every day as you were. And really, I think it's a great experience, and everything you put in your book, of course, is a part of your personal experience. And I'm absolutely sure that that your books really is and will be a great input and great to the further studies of Maidan. Maybe in some 10, 20 years, it will be some department, Maidan studies. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? And your books will be presented at the entrance of the department, because it's very, very, very important to share with the world these concepts, to share with the world all our ideas about Maidan. Thank you so much for your great participation, for your great presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. It was an honor.
Thank you all
Yeah,
for
thank you so
joining.
much.
Thank you very much for this
Yes,
evening.
Ukrainian KOLO, Ukrainian Fulbright Association, is always waiting for you, for your new books, for you in person. Please come to see us in Kyiv.
Ladies, I want to thank you not only for sharing your ideas and for the book presentations, but for your constant interest to Ukraine and for the huge support American people and American state provides. So I was really glad to see you here today, and I hope it's not the last time. So thank you once more.
Дуже дякуємо
For what
і
you're doing.
Дуже дякуємо. Дуже дякуємо.
Дякуємо.
and thank you
Дякуємо
Ira,
вам.
as well. Thank you all.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава.
Слава.
Героям слава.